The afternoon Harlan Briggs decided to ruin Lenora Whitfield. He did it with a smile. He rode up to Silver Crown's gate while Lenora was out checking fence line. She found out later he'd planned it that way and told her ranch foreman, Dale Cutler, that the northern grazing lease had been transferred. Signed over. Done. Said the county had reviewed the original paperwork and found it defective. Said Lenora's father had never held proper title to those 12,000 acres. Said it with the same easy smile he used when he was buying a man a drink before taking his wallet. Dale came back to the house white-faced, hands shaking. Lenora read the notice 3 times before she understood what Harlan had actually done. He hadn't just stolen land. He had pulled the ground out from under 900 cattle, with winter already tightening around the mountains like a fist. If this kind of story moves you the kind where ordinary people refuse to be broken, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Tap the like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Lenora Whitfield had not cried at her father's funeral. She had stood at the edge of the grave in the Wyoming wind, with her jaw set and her hands folded, and watched them lower the casket, while every rancher in the county watched her, waiting to see if she would break. She hadn't. She'd thanked the pastor, shaken hands, accepted the covered dishes that arrived at the house for the next 3 days, and then sat alone in her father's study with the account ledgers spread across his desk and began learning exactly what she had inherited. What she'd inherited was complicated. Silver Crown Ranch was one of the most recognized cattle operations in northern Wyoming, 12,000 acres of prime grazing land, a house large enough to feel empty with only one person inside, a bunkhouse with room for 18 hands, and a reputation her father Amos had built over 30 years of stubborn, unglamorous work. It was also carrying significant debt from a rough previous season, a pension obligation to 3 aging hands her father had promised to take care of, and a foreman named Dale Cutler who was competent, but who had never once in 20 years made a decision without first asking Amos Whitfield what he thought. Lenora was 31 years old and had been managing Silver Crown's finances for 6 of those years. She understood contracts, she understood ledgers, she understood the cattle market in ways her father had eventually admitted surpassed his own grasp of numbers. What she didn't entirely understand yet was the land itself, the way experienced cattlemen read the grass and the sky and the behavior of animals the way other people read words on a page. She had grown up watching that knowledge. She hadn't fully absorbed it. That gap, she knew, was something the county's ranchers were counting on. The summer had been dry in ways that went past ordinary drought. By August, the northern pastures were brittle. The creek that fed the grazing land on Silver Crown's upper range had dropped to a trickle by mid-July, 2 months earlier than any old-timer could remember. The cattle had managed. Lenora had moved them in rotations, pulled water from the lower wells, bought supplemental feed at prices that made her wince every time she signed the invoices. They'd managed, but barely, and the herd had gone into fall thinner than she wanted. Now it was October, and the problem had a name, and the name was Blackstone Pass. Every fall, Silver Crown's cattle made the drive through Blackstone Pass to the sheltered winter range on the south side of the mountains. It was a hard drive, 40 miles through increasingly rough terrain, 3 days minimum under good conditions, but the south range had natural wind protection, reliable water from 2 year-round springs, and enough stored grass to carry a full herd through even a brutal Wyoming winter. Without that winter range, a herd the size of Silver Crown's had nowhere protected to go. The north pastures were exposed. If a serious blizzard hit early, they'd be burying cattle by December. The drive had to happen, and then Dale Cutler broke his leg. He'd been checking fence on the rocky eastern boundary when his horse stepped wrong, coming down a slope. The horse recovered. Dale didn't, or rather, Dale recovered eventually, but not before the doctor in Clearwater had set the bone and informed him in plain terms that he would be walking with a cane for at least 2 months and riding not at all until spring. Dale had taken the news with the stoic silence of a man who'd spent 40 years pretending pain was an inconvenience. Then he'd asked Lenora what she wanted him to do. Rest, she'd told him. I can still direct from the rest, Dale. He'd shut up, which told her he was hurting worse than he was letting on. Without Dale, 3 of Silver Crown's most experienced hands had looked at the drive ahead, looked at the remaining crew, and quietly announced they'd accepted positions with the new railroad operation moving through Casper. The money was better, the work was safer, and they were sorry about the timing. Miss Whitfield, genuinely sorry, but a man had to look out for himself. Lenora had thanked them for their service and watched them ride out, and then gone back to her desk and done the arithmetic again, more carefully, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. She had 11 riders left. For a drive of this size, through terrain this difficult, this late in the season, she needed at minimum 16, and she needed experienced ones. Not the 3 young ranch hands who'd been working cattle for less than 2 years and still looked startled when a steer did something unexpected. She'd sent word to the neighboring operations. Harlan Briggs had been the first to respond, which should have told her something. Harlan owned the second largest cattle operation in the county, a sprawling outfit called Redstone that his father had built and that Harlan had expanded through a combination of genuine business talent and a willingness to operate in legal gray areas that kept his competitors perpetually uncomfortable. He was 53, wide through the shoulders, with a rancher's permanent squint and hands that looked like they'd been carved from saddle leather. He was also, Lenora knew, a man who collected debts the way other men collected livestock patiently, methodically, and always with an eye toward the moment when collection would be most advantageous. He'd come to Silver Crown 2 days after she sent word, sat across from her in the study, and listened to what she needed. Then he'd offered to provide 4 experienced riders, but only if Lenora agreed to sell Redstone's the grazing rights to Silver Crown's eastern 2,000 acres at a price he named that was roughly 60% of fair market value. Lenora had asked him to leave. The other neighboring operations had been politer about their refusals. Short-staffed themselves, couldn't spare the men. Too late in the season to risk riders on a drive through Blackstone Pass under these conditions. Terribly sorry, Miss Whitfield. Your father was a good man. We hope you find a solution. What they meant, and didn't say, was that they weren't entirely sure Silver Crown would survive the winter under Lenora's management, and they weren't interested in investing manpower in an operation that might collapse. Better to wait and see. Better to be available in spring to discuss the purchase of land from a ranching widow who'd learned some hard lessons. Lenora understood exactly what they were doing. She also understood she was running out of time. The clouds building over the northern mountains had a look she'd seen in her father's weather journals, that particular heavy gray white that meant serious snow was coming, and coming before the calendar said it should. She'd watched those clouds for 2 days. She'd checked the temperature drops every morning. She'd read every note her father had ever written about early season weather at this elevation. The herd had to move within the next 10 days, maybe fewer. She was sitting with this problem surrounded by the ledgers, the weather notes, her father's old maps spread across the desk, 3 untouched cups of coffee gone cold when Dale knocked on the study door. He came in on his crutch, face set against the discomfort of moving, and stood just inside the doorway. "There's a man at the gate," Dale said, asking about work. Lenora didn't look up from the map. "What kind of work?" "Cattle work. Says he's a drover. He's got a horse that's seen better days, and not much else that I can see." "How old?" 40, give or take. Hard to tell with trailmen. Lenora looked up then. "What's your read on him?" Dale was quiet for a moment. Dale's reads on men were rarely wrong, and he knew she knew that. "He stood at the gate and waited to be invited in," Dale said finally. "Didn't come up to the house on his own. Sat his horse and waited. And when I walked out to speak with him, he looked at the cattle in the near pasture before he looked at me." Lenora pushed her chair back. She pulled on her coat and walked out to the gate herself. The man sitting the aging gray horse at Silver Crown's entrance was not what she'd pictured from Dale's description. Dale had said 40, this man could have been 38, or could have been 45. The sun and wind and whatever life he'd been living had settled into his face in ways that made the calendar irrelevant. He was lean in the way that trail work made men lean, not the lean of someone going hungry, but the lean of someone who hadn't sat still in years. His coat was decent, but worn at the elbows. His saddle was old, but well maintained. She noticed that immediately. Because a man who took care of his equipment when he had little else was telling you something specific about his character. He looked at her when she approached the gate. He didn't smile, didn't tip his hat, didn't say anything for a moment. "You're Miss Whitfield," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am, and you're looking for cattle work." "I am. I need drovers for a drive through Blackstone Pass. Leaving inside the week. It's late in the season, the terrain is rough, and I'm short on experienced hands. The work is hard, and the weather isn't going to cooperate." She watched his face while she said it. Some men heard that and started calculating reasons to decline. This man just kept listening. "Wages are good. Better than good. I need experienced men, and I'm willing to pay for them." She named a figure. He didn't react to it. Just looked at the pasture the way Dale had described, not with the calculation of a man estimating the herd's dollar value, but with the specific attention of someone reading the condition of the animals. "Those steers in the far corner," he said. "The three bunched up near the water trough. How long have they been off their feed?" Lenora turned and looked. She hadn't noticed those three. She looked back at the man and felt something shift in her chest, the specific discomfort of realizing that someone else had seen something on her land that she'd missed. "I'll need to check on that," she said, keeping her voice even. "You'll want to separate them before the drive. If it's respiratory, it'll move through the herd fast in the cold." She studied him for a moment. "You know cattle?" "Some." "What's your name?" "Bram Mercer." She opened the gate. "Come up to the house, and we'll talk terms." He didn't move immediately. She turned back to look at him. He was looking past her, toward the road, looking at something. She realized that wasn't there yet. "There's something I need to say first," Bram said. "Before we talk terms." "Go ahead." He turned and looked toward the road again, and now she could see it, a wagon, moving slowly up the track from the main road, being driven by someone who was managing the reins with visible care. It pulled to a stop just off the road about 50 yards back, and Lenora could see now that it was older than Bram's saddle, and that there were shapes in the back of it. Small shapes. "I've got 4 children," Bram said. "Tobin is 13, Elsie is 11, Reed is 8. June just turned 6. He said it the way a man says something he has said many times, and will keep saying for as long as he has to. Steadily, without apology, but without the ease of someone who expects it to land well. Their mother died 2 years ago. I've had them since. Wherever I work, they come with me." Lenora looked at the wagon. She looked back at him. "Nobody hires me without hiring my family," Bram said. "That's not a negotiation. That's just how it is." She had needed a drover. She had not anticipated this complication. She ran the arithmetic. Quickly, the house was large. The bunkhouse wasn't appropriate for children. There was no one to supervise 4 young children while their father worked a cattle drive. And the drive itself was going to be dangerous enough without. June chose that moment to stand up in the back of the wagon and wave. She was smaller than Lenora had expected for 6, and she waved with her whole arm, enthusiastically, the way very young children wave at people when they haven't yet learned that not everyone wants to be waved at. Lenora raised her hand and waved back before she'd made a decision. "Your wages stand," she said, "for all 5 of you." Bram looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not gratitude, exactly. More like the careful assessment of a man who has been promised things before and learned to hold promises lightly until they proved themselves. "You sure about that? Bring your wagon up," Lenora said. The next hour was one of the stranger hours Lenora had experienced since her father's death. She'd expected the children to be. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Quiet, maybe. Worn-looking. She'd had a vague image of 4 subdued, trail-weary children filing into the house and needing to be fed. What actually happened was that the wagon pulled up to the house and Tobin climbed down first, serious-faced, 13, in the way that 13 sometimes looked like 40, when a boy had been doing a man's share of work and helped Elsie down, and then Reed jumped from the wagon bed without waiting for help and landed, and immediately spotted the horses in the near paddock and said, "How many head do you run?" To nobody in particular. June climbed down last, slowly, with great deliberateness, and then walked directly up to Lenora and looked up at her with the specific, fearless curiosity of a 6-year-old who has learned that new places mean new people, and new people might be interesting. "Do you have a cat?" June asked. I know, Lenora said. Not currently. We had a cat in Kansas, but we couldn't bring her. June considered this. She was gray. Her name was Marble. That's a good name for a gray cat. I know. June looked around the property. Do you have children? No. Why not, June? This was Bram, coming around the wagon with a quiet firmness. It's not a question you ask. June looked at him. Why not? Because it's personal. Oh. She turned back to Lenora, apparently unbothered. Sorry. It's all right, Lenora said, and was startled to find that she meant it. Bram met her eyes over June's head, something that might have been a suppressed apology, or might have been a suppressed smile, moved across his face and was gone. Lenora showed them the house. The children's room, which had been used for storage and required 20 minutes of clearing before it was habitable, had 2 beds, which Tobin and Bram arranged without being asked. Tobin moving furniture, while Bram found extra blankets in the hall chest. Elsie asked, with careful politeness, where she might find the kitchen, and when Lenora showed her, Elsie looked around the kitchen with the evaluating gaze of someone who had been managing meals for a family and was assessing new equipment. Reed had disappeared in the direction of the stables within 10 minutes of arriving and had to be retrieved by Tobin before supper. Supper was awkward in the way that meals are awkward when 6 people who don't know each other are suddenly sharing a table. Lenora's housekeeper, Martha Vane, a stout woman of 60, who had been at Silver Crown for 15 years and who had greeted the Mercer family's arrival with an expression of profound neutrality that Lenora recognized as Martha reserving. Judgment served a stew that was hot and adequate. The children ate without complaint, which Lenora took as evidence that they'd learned early not to complain about food. You've done drives through Blackstone before, Lenora asked Bram across the table. 3 times, twice in good conditions, once in early snow. What happened in the snow? Lost 11 head at the river crossing. Could have been worse. Would have been worse if we'd waited another day. What made you push through? Bram looked at her with the expression of someone deciding how much of a real answer to give. Guy. The way the cattle were moving. Sometimes you know the window is closing and the only thing you can do is move. My foreman would have said the same thing. Where's your foreman? Broken leg, out until spring. Bram nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet Lenora became aware that he was actually thinking, not just waiting for his turn to speak in the specific way that people think when they're running through implications and consequences. Tell me about the herd's condition, he said. They talked about cattle through most of the meal. The children ate and listened, and occasionally one of them asked a question. Reed had several questions, most of them specific and surprisingly well-informed for an 8-year-old, but mostly it was Lenora and Bram. And by the end of the meal, the table had stopped feeling 6 strangers and started feeling like something she couldn't quite name. The following morning, Bram was already in the pasture when Lenora came down at first light. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched him move through the herd. He moved slowly, unhurried, the way experienced cattlemen moved, not sneaking, but quiet. He stopped at the 3 steers she'd identified the night before and spent a long time looking at them. Then he went to the water trough and looked at it. Then he walked the fence line along the eastern boundary and crouched down at 2 places she couldn't see clearly enough to understand. When he came into the house for breakfast, he had a list. He set it on the table in front of her. It was written on the back of an envelope, in small, precise handwriting. It listed 12 things. Lenora picked it up and read it. She put it down and looked at him. You walked the whole pasture this morning? Part of it. The rest I'll get to today. She looked at the list again. 3 of the items she'd already identified. 4 of them she'd missed. 5 of them she hadn't known to look for. The water situation at point 4, she said. What's wrong with it? The trough float valve is sticking. Cattle have been getting inconsistent water access. In cold weather, that gets worse. You'll want it replaced before the drive. I have 3 young hands who aren't ready for a drive like this, Lenora said. Honestly, I know. I watched them yesterday. He poured himself coffee without asking if it was all right to do so, and somehow this didn't bother her. It had the quality of something that was simply practical. A man who understood that in a working household, you didn't wait to be served. Pull them off the drive. Put them on ranch maintenance and herd management while we're out. I can handle that. Better for them and better for the drive. That leaves me with 8 experienced riders plus you. 9 is enough if they're the right 9. Who's your best among them? Told him. He nodded. He'd clearly already been observing the hands, forming assessments of his own. He asked 2 specific questions about 2 of the riders, questions about their experience in mountain terrain, in bad weather, and she answered them, and when she was done, he was quiet again, working through something. We need to separate the drive into smaller working groups, he said. You've got too many cattle to run as a single mass through terrain that narrow. We'll move in 3 groups, staggered. It's slower, but you lose fewer animals. That's not how my father ran this drive. Your father was running it in better conditions with a larger crew, Bram said. He said it without challenge, just as a fact, the way you'd correct a wrong measurement. The canyon section past the 3rd crossing gets dangerous with a full herd pressing from behind. You break it up. You manage the pressure. Lenora looked at her father's maps. She had stood in this study, at this desk, with her father, watching him plan drives that she'd been too young to participate in. She had absorbed his methods and trusted them the way you trust a method that has worked for 30 years. But her father hadn't driven 900 cattle in an early drought year with a depleted crew through a pass with snow, appearing 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Show me, she said. She pushed the map toward him. He pulled it closer and began talking, and she listened, and when she disagreed with something, she said so. And he explained his reasoning, and twice he was wrong, and she told him so, and he looked at the map again and said she was right. It was the most useful conversation about cattle management she'd had since her father died. When Dale came in on his crutch an hour later and found the 2 of them bent over the map, he looked between them with the expression of a man filing something away for later consideration. The drive prep, Dale said. What do you need me to handle from here? The supply inventory, Lenora said. I want to know exactly what we're taking. And someone needs to look at the packs on the supply mules. I don't think 3 of them have been properly checked since August. Dale nodded. He looked at Bram. You're taking point on the drive? If Miss Whitfield wants it that way. They both looked at Lenora. He's taking point, Lenora said. Dale absorbed this. He gave Bram a look that contained a full conversation, the compressed assessment of an old ranch hand evaluating a stranger who had, in the space of less than 24 hours, moved into a position of considerable authority. Then he nodded. All right, Dale said. And that was that. The 3 days before the drive were organized chaos of the specific kind that Lenora had come to associate with any large undertaking, the kind where the plan looked clean on paper and reality kept introducing complications that had to be absorbed without derailing the larger structure. The float valve got replaced. The supply packs got repacked. 2 of the older horses in the remuda got pulled and rested on the veterinarian's advice, which meant reshuffling which riders were on which horses. One of the 9 riders, a man named Pratt, who'd been with Silver Crown for 4 years, developed a cough severe enough that Lenora pulled him from the drive over his objection, which meant they were riding with 8. 8, Lenora said that evening in the study, working through the revised calculations. 8 works, Bram said. You keep saying that, because it does. He was looking at the map again. He had a habit of returning to the maps when he was working something through. She'd noticed it over the past 3 days, the way he'd go quiet and still and trace routes with his finger, not drawing on the paper but reading it. You run your groups at 3, 3, 2. The back group is your safety net. They ride slower. They're watching for strays. They're the ones who can pull back if something goes wrong at the front. And if something goes wrong at the front while the back group is dealing with strays, then you deal with what's in front of you first and trust the back group to handle what's in front of them. He looked up. There's no drive where every problem gets solved at the same time. You handle them in order. My father would have said something similar. Smart man. He was. A silence settled. Not uncomfortable. Outside, the wind was picking up. She could hear it in the eaves. That particular low sound that meant weather was moving, and the question was only how fast. The snow on the ridge, Lenora said. I've been watching it the past 3 days. It's lower than it was, yes. How much time do you think we have? Bram was quiet for a moment. In 3 days, she'd learned to read his silences. There were the short ones that meant he was formulating a sentence. And there were the longer ones that meant he was genuinely calculating, running variables. This was a longer one. 8 days, he said, maybe 9. The pass won't close before then, probably. He paused. We're not going to get lucky with the weather. We need to move before we're ready and accept that. We leave day after tomorrow, Lenora said. We leave tomorrow. She looked at him. Tonight I thought we had 8 days. Looking at that ridge now. He nodded toward the window, toward the mountains she couldn't see in the dark, but knew were there. Tomorrow we leave. Lenora thought about all the things that weren't finished. The supply pack she'd wanted to reorganize. The 2 young horses that hadn't been trail tested. The full equipment check she'd planned for the morning. Tomorrow, she said. She went to find Dale. The children were still awake. When she passed the room, she could hear the murmur of voices through the partially open door. Bram's voice reading something aloud, low and steady, and smaller voices asking questions and being answered. She didn't stop, but she slowed for a moment outside the door. June's voice, are you coming back? Bram's voice, I'm always coming back. What if there's a storm? Then I come back through the storm. What if June, firm, gentle, I'm always coming back. Go to sleep. Lenora walked on to find Dale. She didn't examine why she was still hearing those words 20 minutes later when she was going through supply inventory. I'm always coming back. The morning of the drive was cold and dark and organized with the imperfect efficiency that Lenora had learned to expect things missing, things appearing unexpectedly, a steer that had gotten through a fence gap in the night and needed retrieving. By the time the sun broke over the eastern ridge, they were moving, the herd flowing north toward the mountain pass in the staggered groups Bram had laid out, Silver Crown's riders taking their positions without ceremony. Lenora rode at the middle position between groups where she could see both front and back. She had driven cattle before not often, but she'd done it. Her seat was solid. Her horse, a steady 7-year-old buckskin named Colt, had been through enough drives to stay calm when cattle moved unexpectedly. Bram rode point. She noticed within the first hour, not what she'd expected in the way he led. She'd expected more noise, more directing, more command. What she got was almost silence. He moved the lead cattle with small adjustments, a shift of his horse's position, a sound that was just below the level of language. And the cattle moved the way cattle moved when they were being led by someone they didn't feel the need to argue with. It was a skill she had seen her father have in his better years. She hadn't expected to see it in a man she'd hired 3 days ago. By midday, they were 6 miles into the drive, and the first cloud cover was rolling in from the northwest. By afternoon, the temperature had dropped 4 degrees. Bram rode back to her position during the mid-afternoon rest. The lead group is moving well, he said. The middle is bunching. Tell your man Hayes to give them more left room. They're feeling crowded. Tell him. Also, he paused, looking north. Clouds had thickened in the past hour. Tell your riders in the back group to push the pace slightly. I don't want too much distance between the groups when the light goes. You think it'll come tonight? I think it'll come when it comes, and I'd rather have everyone close when it does. She nodded. He turned his horse. Bram, he looked back. Children. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out of something she'd been carrying since the night before, since that conversation she'd overheard through the door. Martha will keep them safe at the house. She's capable. He looked at her for a moment. The wind was picking up around them, pulling at her coat collar. I know, he said. I know, Miss Whitfield. Something in his face shifted briefly, not quite gratitude, not quite acknowledgement, something that existed in the space between them. Then he turned and rode back to point. She watched him go. Colt shifted under her, picking up on some change in the air pressure, and she steadied him automatically and turned back to the drive. 42 miles to winter pasture. The clouds were moving fast. The herd was moving slower. And somewhere behind them, 4 children were sitting in a stone ranch house while the first real weather of the season began building itself across the mountain sky, like something that had been planning this arrival for a very long time. The snow on the ridge looked closer in the morning light than it had the night before. Lenora knew it wasn't actually closer. Snow didn't move downhill overnight on its own, but the angle of the early sun hit the high peaks differently than dusk did. And what had looked like a distant concern 12 hours ago now had the quality of something specific and immediate. She'd been up since before first light, standing at the edge of camp with her coffee, watching it, trying to read it the way her father had read weather. She wasn't sure she was reading it correctly, and that uncertainty sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong. Bram was already moving through the herd when the rest of the camp woke. He did that every morning. She'd noted it on the first day, and every day since, the way he was always already in the pasture, or the herd before the light was fully up, doing his own assessment before the day's plan got set. He came back to camp this morning with mud on his boots and a look on his face that she'd learned to read as the expression of a man who had found a problem and was deciding how to present it. "Talk," she said. He poured coffee first. She'd stopped noting that, too. 12 animals on the far west edge were off their feet when I came through. They're up now, moving, but they were slow getting up. Cold settled into them hard last night. How bad? Not bad enough to pull from the drive. Bad enough to watch. He drank. We need to move the vulnerable ones to the center of each group. Warmer there, less exposed to wind. It'll slow the pace slightly, but the alternative is losing them in the pass. "Do it," she said. "What else?" "That's the main thing." He paused. "Pass itself, I want to scout it before we push the full herd through. The snow line dropped overnight. If the upper section is iced, the approach changes. How much time does scouting add? 2 hours if I go now and push the horse." Thought about it. 2 hours was real. 2 hours in weather that was building could mean the difference between a manageable push through the pass and a full confrontation with whatever was coming down from the northwest. "Take Gallagher," she said. "He's faster on that gray than you are on your horse." Bram looked at her. "Don't argue with me about it," she said. 2 riders can split the upper and lower approach and cut the scout time by 40 minutes. He didn't argue. He set his cup down and went to find Gallagher. She spent the 2 hours reorganizing the vulnerable animals into the center positions of each group, which was less straightforward than it sounded, because cattle had their own opinions about where they wanted to walk, and moving a reluctant steer from one position in a herd to another without disturbing the surrounding animals was the kind of work that looked simple from a distance and wasn't. Hayes helped. So did Sanchez. The young rider Carver turned out to be better at it than she'd expected, patient, quiet-handed, with the natural instinct for reading when an animal was about to commit to a decision and cutting it off before it did. "You've done this before," she told him, which wasn't quite a question. "Grew up on a sheep operation," Carver said. He had the slightly defensive tone of a young man mentioning something he wasn't sure would be received well among cattle people. "Different animal. Same principle, she agreed. Bram and Gallagher came back in 90 minutes, which meant they'd pushed hard. Gallagher's gray was blowing, and Bram's aging horse looked like it had opinions about the pace, but had kept them to itself. Both men were cold in the way that came from riding into wind at elevation, which was different from standing still cold, the kind that got into your face and hands, regardless of how well you were bundled. "Upper approach is clear," Gallagher reported. He had a scratch on his left hand from something. Probably brush. "Ice on 2 sections of the trail, but manageable. We mark it and keep the pace slow through those parts." "And the pass itself?" Lenora asked. Bram took this one. "Narrow. Narrower than I remembered, which means either my memory is wrong or there's been some rockfall on the eastern face since I last came through. Probably rockfall. There's fresh debris on the right side of the approach." He was looking at the pass, visible now from camp as a gap in the ridgeline, dark against the white sky. "We can get 900 cattle through it, but we do it in smaller pulls than we planned, and we do it before noon." "It's past 8, Lenora said. "Then we leave now." She was already turning. "Break camp," she called to the nearest riders. "Move." What happened next was the organized urgency of a crew that had been working together long enough to skip the unnecessary steps. Fires got stamped out. Packs got loaded fast and imperfect. She'd find things that were packed wrong when they unpacked on the other side, but that was a problem for later. The cattle, responding to the increased human activity around them, began moving with more energy than they'd shown in 2 mornings, which was both useful and slightly worrying. A herd that was energy running because it was spooked was harder to manage than one that was walking steady. Easy, Bram said, passing through the lead group on his horse. Not loudly, just enough. The lead animals heard him, and the particular authority of his presence, the specific body language of a man who expected to be listened to, and usually was moved through the group and steadied it. Lenora watched that happen. She'd been watching it for 3 days, and it still wasn't entirely explicable to her. It wasn't magic, it was a skill, but it was a skill she didn't fully have, and was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that. They were moving within 20 minutes. The approach to the pass took longer than the scouts had found it, which was predictable scouting terrain, and moving 900 cattle through terrain were activities that bore only a passing resemblance to each other. The marked ice sections slowed the front group to a careful walk, and the careful walk rippled back through all 3 groups and compressed the distance between them in ways that required constant adjustment from the riders. The walls of the approach rose on either side in gray broken rock, and the sky above was the color of old pewter, not threatening in the dramatic way of a storm sky, but the kind of flat, heavy gray that felt like a ceiling pressing down. Cattle felt it. Lenora could see it in the way the lead animals held their heads, not the alert, fearful high head of a spooked animal, but the lowered, uncertain stance of animals that could sense something they didn't like and were looking for direction about what to do with that information. She kept her pace steady. She kept Colt's pace steady. She realized, providing a performance of calm she was not entirely feeling, and the cattle were, apparently, convinced by it, which was either a success or an indictment of her acting ability. The first real trouble came at the rockfall section. Bram had identified it in the scout, but seeing it and moving 900 cattle through it were different things. The debris from the eastern face had narrowed the trail by nearly a third in one section, maybe 30 feet of passable ground, instead of 50, and while 30 feet was workable for horses, and even for individual cattle. For cattle moving in a group, with momentum behind them, it created a pressure point, a place where the natural tendency of the herd to push forward met the physical reality of the space available. Here, Bram said, pulling up. He looked at the rockfall, looked at the trail, looked at the herd behind them. We pull groups down to 15 through this section. Not 30. 15 animals at a time. Ride them through and collect on the other side before the next group comes. Going to take, I know. Do it anyway. She called the order back through the riders. She heard Hayes repeat it, heard Sanchez relay it further back. She heard the particular sound of experienced riders adjusting the brief complaints that were really just acknowledgement that the situation had changed, not actual objection. 15 animals at a time. The rockfall section took an hour and 40 minutes. Lenora was through with the first group, waiting on the north side of the debris while the second group filed through, when the wind changed. It had been coming from the northwest all morning. It shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably swinging around to come more directly from the north, and with the shift came a drop in temperature that was perceptible even through her coat. Not the gradual cooling of a normal temperature change. The specific sudden cold that came when weather moved. She looked at Bram. He was already looking at the sky. "How far to the other side of the pass?" she said. 3 miles. "And the back group is still a mile back from here." "Maybe more." He turned his horse, scanning. She could see him running the arithmetic, and she was running the same arithmetic, and they were arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. The back group was not going to make it through the narrow section before the weather changed in a significant way. "Options," she said. "Get your front group through fast. Get the middle group through fast. Pull the back group tight and hold them below the rockfall until we know what we're dealing with." "Hold them where?" "That's no shelter there. It's better than the pass if the pass closes." He looked at her directly. "If this is serious weather coming, the pass is the worst place to be with cattle. Exposed. No room to maneuver. We get as many through as we can and we shelter the rest below. We'd be splitting the herd. We'd be keeping half of it alive. Which beats the alternative." She hated the logic. She acknowledged the logic. "Do it," she said. The next 40 minutes were the hardest riding she'd done in years. She and Bram pushed the middle group through the rockfall section at a pace that was faster than she'd wanted, not reckless. but close to the edge of what was manageable, and the cattle responded, the way cattle responded when they felt urgency in the riders, which was with their own urgency, their own push, their own desire to move that had to be channeled rather than fighting it. She lost 2 animals from the middle group at the north end of the rockfall. When they broke right into the debris, Gallagher went after them, was gone 10 minutes. Came back with one of the 2, and a look that said the other one wasn't retrievable, and he'd made the right call coming back. She didn't ask. He'd made the right call. The sky went from flat gray to something darker, while the middle group was still filing through. Not black, not the dramatic sudden dark of a summer storm. Something more gradual and more final, the specific dimming of light that came when a front moved in overhead, and the cloud layer thickened from merely overcast to something with weight and purpose behind it. The first snow came when the last of the middle group cleared the rockfall. Not heavy, just a beginning fine, dry flakes that the wind was moving horizontally rather than letting fall. Kind of snow that didn't look serious until you'd been in it for 20 minutes and realized it was accumulating on everything, regardless of how light it seemed. Bram pulled alongside her. Back group is holding below the debris, he said. Hayes has them. How many? Roughly 280. She did the math. A little over 600 through the rockfall. 280 still on the south side of the debris field, sheltered only by the approach walls and whatever Hayes could manage. The pass, she said. Your front group is 3/4 through. Another 20 minutes, they'll be on the other side. Then we hold position and assess. Assess what exactly? The snow is here. The snow is here, but it's not serious yet. Whether it gets serious is what we're assessing. He paused. I've seen this kind of front stall. The cold comes through and the snow spits, and then it passes and you get 3 more days of cold, but clear. And if it doesn't stall, he looked at the sky. Then we make different decisions, he said. The front group cleared the pass in 22 minutes. On the north side of the pass, the terrain opened into the broader protected valley that was Silver Crown's winter range, and protected was the right word. The ridgeline blocked the worst of the northwest wind, and the valley floor held enough residual grass that even a thin grazed herd could stabilize here through a hard winter. It was the destination they'd been working toward for 3 days. Standing on the north side of the pass, Lenora could feel the difference in the wind, still cold, but directional rather than brutal, cut by the ridgeline to something manageable. She did not feel the satisfaction she'd expected. 600 cattle on the right side of the pass. 280 on the wrong side, and the snow that had started as fine horizontal flakes was now something with more weight to it, still not a blizzard. Not yet, but building toward something. She turned Colt and rode back through the pass. Bram was already riding the other direction back toward her. They met in the narrowest section, horses almost shoulder to shoulder in the confined space, both of them looking the other direction toward the approach trail where the back group was holding below the debris. The weather is building, she said. I can see that. How bad is it going to get before we can move them? I don't know. He said it plainly, without apology, which was more honest than she'd expected and more valuable than a confident estimate would have been. Can we move 280 cattle through the rockfall section in building snow? In light snow, yes. In a real blizzard, no, so we move them now. We move them now, he agreed. They went back through together. What followed was the most difficult 2 hours of the entire drive. The snow had gone from building to serious by the time they reached Hayes and the back group, and serious meant visibility reduced to 50 yards and reduced further in gusts. And reduced visibility meant the cattle couldn't see the riders clearly, and the riders couldn't see the terrain clearly, and everyone was operating on instinct and experience, and the specific determination that comes from not having any alternative. Hayes had done good work holding the group. The animals were bunched tight, but not panicked. He'd kept them moving in small circles, which had kept them generating heat and kept them from the particular stillness of animals that start to give up. He looked exhausted when Lenora and Bram reached him. The rockfall section, Hayes said, in this visibility. We walk it slow, Bram said. Riders on both sides. Physical contact with the debris markers I set this morning. You can feel them if you can't see them. You set debris markers? Lenora said. When we scouted this morning. Gallagher stacked stones on both sides of the clear path. He looked at her. I was hoping we wouldn't need them. She thought about him setting those markers in the pre-dawn cold of the scouting run, setting them for an emergency that he hadn't known would come, but had prepared for anyway. She thought about what that habit of preparation said about how he moved through the world. Filed it away and moved. The back group through the rockfall section was not an operation that would have impressed anyone watching. It was loud and slow and required 4 separate restarts when sections of the group stopped and refused to move into the diminished visibility of the debris zone. Bram and Lenora worked both sides of the debris field, Gallagher and Hayes worked the herd from behind, and the young rider's Carver, Briggs filled in wherever the gaps appeared and did it without being told, which Lenora took note of with the specific appreciation of a rancher who knew that the ability to see what needed doing without being directed was rarer and more valuable than raw skill. 2 animals were lost in the debris zone. Not to injury, they simply disappeared into the snow and the rocky terrain and couldn't be found in the limited visibility and the limited time. Lenora marked them in her head and kept moving. The last of the back group cleared the rockfall as the snow went from serious to something she'd describe as angry the wind, picking up to the point where it had force behind it, driving the snow sideways in a way that stung exposed skin and made the horses want to turn their faces away from it. Through the pass. The pass itself was the worst section exposed ridge, with no shelter on either side, the wind coming through the gap with nothing to impede it. The kind of cold and driving snow that disoriented animals and made them uncertain about which direction was forward. Lenora rode at the left edge of the trail, Bram at the right, both of them calling she'd abandoned the low quiet of a normal drive. It was useless in this wind, calling the cattle through, in voices raised enough to carry over the weather. They made it through. On the north side of the pass, with the winter range opening ahead of them and the ridgeline cutting the worst of the wind, the cattle slowed and settled with the particular collective relief of animals that could feel conditions improving around them. Lenora counted. She counted 3 times, because the first count didn't match the second count, and she wanted a third before she believed either. Third count matched the second. 864, she said. Bram had come to the same number from his own count. He was quiet for a moment. 36, he said. 36 from the drive. She paused. The rest we go back and account for in spring. Some of them may have sheltered in the lower valley. Some of them will have. It wasn't a lie of comfort, it was genuine possibility. Animals could shelter in hard weather and be found afterward that weren't lost, just separated. But it was also true that some of the 36 were simply gone, and they both knew it and didn't say it. 864 cattle in protected winter range was still an outcome that 2 weeks ago she wouldn't have guaranteed herself. The riders made camp that night in the Winter Range Valley with the efficiency and silence of people who had been through something together and were still sorting out what to do with the fact that they'd come out the other side of it. The snow continued above the pass. She could see it in the darkness. The sky over the ridge still active, but in the valley it was merely cold, the occasional light snow that settled and meant nothing. Bram came to her fire. He sat without the question of whether he was staying long enough, which was different from the earlier nights, and looked at the fire and didn't say anything for a while. 864, she said finally. Yes, my father's best drive was 891 from a smaller herd. Fewer miles, better conditions. Bram looked at her. This was not a normal drive, he said. No, she paused. I know that. They sat with the fire for a while. Around them, the camp was quieter than the previous nights, not the tired quiet of people who'd worked hard, but the particular quiet of people who'd been afraid and weren't afraid anymore, and didn't quite have the language for the space between those two things. The children, Bram said. He said it's the way you said something you'd been not saying for a while. They're fine, Lenora said. Martha is capable, the ranch house is solid. The storm was above the pass, it didn't hit the valley where Silver Crown sits. I know that logically. He looked at the fire. Logic and being away from them are different things. She understood that specific gap, the space between knowing something and feeling it in ways that didn't require explanation. 2 days back, she said. Maybe less if the weather on the south side has cleared. I know, he was quiet again. She could see, watching his face in the firelight, the particular way a person held something they couldn't put down, and couldn't stop thinking about not panic, not weakness, just the weight of what mattered. June asked you if you were coming back, Lenora said. She wasn't entirely sure why she said it. Maybe because it had been sitting in her for days, that small voice through the door. Bram looked at her. Something moved through his expression. She asks every time, he said. She's been asking since the first time I left for work after Clara died. Every time I go anywhere. He paused. Every time I come back, she stops asking for a few days. Then it starts again. You always come back, yes. He said it simply. Not as performance of strength, just as fact. But she's 6. The fact and the fear are different things. Lenora looked at the fire. She'll be standing at the window when we ride in, she said. I'd bet on it. Something crossed his face, the almost smile she'd seen before, brief and warm and involuntary, the specific expression of a parent whose child was being described accurately by someone else. Probably waving, he said. Definitely waving, Lenora said. They sat with that for a while, comfortable in the way that comfortable silences become comfortable between people who have been through hard things together and don't need to fill the space with words that don't add anything. The fire burned down, the riders slept, the cattle settled in the valley grass. And somewhere south of the pass, in a stone ranch house Lenora had always thought of as too large for one person, 4 children were either sleeping or not sleeping, and Martha Vane was keeping the fires going. And Silver Crown waited for people who were coming back. All of them coming back. They rode south 2 days later, back through a pass that had gone quiet and cold, in the way that mountains went quiet after they'd said what they needed to say. Storm had spent itself somewhere over the high ridge and left behind a landscape that was clean and brutal and indifferent, the kind of beauty that didn't care whether you appreciated it or survived it. The trail through the debris field was manageable now that the snow had settled and the visibility was full, and Lenora could see clearly what she hadn't been able to see in the driving conditions 2 days prior, how narrow the clear path actually was, how close they'd cut it, how much had depended on Bram's stacked stone markers and the riders' willingness to move through conditions that their better judgment was quietly arguing against. She didn't say any of this out loud. Neither did Bram. Some things you processed in silence because putting them into words too soon made them smaller than they actually were. The riders spoke more freely on the return trip than they had on the drive out. That was normal, the pressure valve of having come through something difficult, releasing into conversation, jokes. The specific storytelling that men did when they were recounting something they'd been too busy surviving to fully experience while it was happening. She heard Gallagher describing the scouting run to Sanchez with considerably more drama than it had contained in real life, and Hayes recounting the rockfall section to Carver with the authority of a man who'd been in the middle of it, and Carver listening with the attentiveness of a young writer who was, Lenora recognized, storing these accounts the way you stored things you intended to use. She rode mostly with Bram, which had become the natural arrangement over the course of the drive without either of them formally deciding it was. They talked about the herd, the condition of the animals they'd gotten through, the 36 that hadn't made it, the specific calculations of what the surviving 864 would mean for Silver Crown's spring position. The spring calf crop, Lenora said. If we get a normal survival rate, we're looking at 600 calves. Depends on how the winter range holds. I've been through that range in spring before. It holds. The East Springs are consistent. How's the shelter situation on the north end? I saw the terrain from the pass, but didn't get close enough to read the wind exposure. Described it. He listened. He asked 2 questions that indicated he was thinking about the specific vulnerabilities of cattle in extended cold weather, and she answered them, and then he was quiet for a while, working through something. You'll want to run a check in January, he said. If the winter goes hard, you'll have some animals that need pulling to protected shelter before February. I know. I'll be here to do it. She looked at him. The statement had come out, simply factually, the way he said most things, but it was also the first time he'd referred to a future at Silver Crown past the current arrangement. He was looking at the trail ahead, apparently not aware of having said anything significant, and she let it go without comment and looked at the trail ahead too, but the words stayed. He'd be here in January. She found she was not unhappy about that. Silver Crown came into view on the afternoon of the second return day, the house and outbuildings visible across the Flatlower Valley in the specific way that home appeared after absence, slightly smaller than remembered, slightly more precious for being real and intact, rather than the mental image you'd been carrying. Sky over the valley was clear. The storm hadn't touched it at anything near the severity it had hit the pass. Lenora saw the small figure at the gate before they were close enough to make out features. June was standing on the bottom rail of the gate, holding on with both hands, and she was watching the approaching riders with an attention that even from this distance had the quality of someone who had been watching for a while and had decided to keep watching until the watching was rewarded. When the riders were close enough to be individually distinguishable, June got off the fence rail and started running. Not toward the group, toward one specific rider at the left position, which meant she'd already identified her father from 50 yards out by something: the horse, the hat, the particular way he sat a saddle, and she was running toward that specific person with the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old who had been told that the person was always coming back and had spent 2 days testing whether that was true. Bram came off his horse before it had fully stopped. June hit him at full speed, and he caught her and went back half a step from the force of it, and then held on. And the 6-year-old wrapped both arms around his neck and both legs around his waist, and held on in the specific way that small children held on when they'd been afraid and were done being afraid. Lenora rode past at a distance that gave them privacy. She was watching the gate rather than them, and Martha Vane was coming out from the house, and Tobin was coming from the direction of the barn with Reed behind him, and Elsie appeared in the kitchen doorway wiping her hands on a cloth. And the scene had the particular quality of a family taking stock of itself after a separation, counting its pieces, confirming they were all present. It was the kind of thing you didn't intrude on. Lenora dismounted and saw to her horse and let Bram see to his family. She was in the barn when Tobin found her. The 13-year-old came in with the careful purposefulness of someone who had something to report and had decided this was the right moment to report it. He waited until she'd handed Colt's lead to the stable hand and then said, "Miss Whitfield, there's something you should know about." She looked at him. "What kind of something?" "A man came to the ranch while you were gone. 2 days after you left." He paused. "He rode up to the gate the same way, Mr. Mercer did, except he didn't wait to be invited in. He came up to the house." "Who was he?" "He said his name was Briggs." Lenora went still. "Harlan Briggs," Tobin confirmed. "He talked to Martha. She didn't let him inside, but she talked to him at the door." He paused again, with the deliberateness of someone who had thought carefully about the order in which he was going to present information. "He left a document. Martha has it." "Where's Martha?" "Kitchen." She walked to the kitchen. Martha Vane was at the stove, and when Lenora came in, Martha turned and went directly to the small desk in the kitchen corner where household accounts were managed, and took out an envelope without Lenora having to ask. The envelope had been opened. "I read it," Martha said, not apologetically. "I wanted to know what it was before you came home to it." "What is it?" "A notice. From the county assessor's office. For something using that letterhead." Martha's voice had a specific flatness that Lenora had learned over 15 years, meant the woman was angry and had decided to be useful rather than dramatic about it. "It says that the leasing arrangement on the northern 12,000 acres has been found to have a defective title, that Amos Whitfield never held proper claim to those acres, and that the lease has been transferred to Redstone Ranch pending a county review." Lenora opened the envelope and read the document. She read it once quickly and once slowly and once more, looking at specific sections. Then she put it on the kitchen table. "This is Harlan Briggs," she said. "That's what I thought. He came to the house himself. 2 days after I left. He timed it," Martha said. "Timed it." Lenora looked at the document. The language was official and dense, in the way that documents intending to intimidate were official and dense, full of legal-sounding phrases that created an impression of authority without necessarily having it. "How did he seem when he was at the door?" "Comfortable," Martha said. "That's what bothered me. He had a confident look about him that I didn't like a man who doesn't expect to be argued with. He usually isn't." Lenora picked up the document again. The northern 12,000 acres was not merely a phrase for grazing land. It was the foundation of Silver Crown's capacity, the range that supported the majority of the herd through spring and early summer before the rotation moved them to the higher pastures. Without it, the ranch's carrying capacity dropped by more than a third. The math was simple and brutal. Fewer acres, fewer cattle, less income, greater debt pressure, and eventually a slow spiral that ended with a forced sale. She knew exactly what Harlan Briggs was doing. She also knew that she couldn't prove it yet, which was a different and more frustrating kind of knowledge. She was still standing in the kitchen with the document when Bram came in. He came in the way he always came into a room without announcement, taking in what was in it before saying anything, and he looked at her face, and then at the document on the table, and then at Martha. And Martha said nothing and went back to the stove. "What happened?" Bram said. She told him. Short and direct, the way she'd learned to talk when she was angry, short sentences, no embellishment, because embellishment let the emotion in and she needed to be thinking, not feeling. He read the document when she handed it to him. He didn't read it the way she had, not with legal attention to the specific language, because that wasn't his kind of reading, but
he read it the way someone read something to understand what another person was actually doing.
And when he put it down, he was quiet for a moment. "He waited until you were gone," Bram said. "Yes. He knew you were going. Everyone in the county knew I was going. The drive was common knowledge." She paused. "He offered to help me before I left. Riders for the price of the eastern 2,000 acres. I declined." Bram looked at the document. "He wants the whole ranch," Bram said. It wasn't a question. He wants enough of it that the rest becomes untenable. She sat down at the kitchen table. The chair was the one she'd sat in since she was a child, the specific one at the corner that had been hers at family meals with her father, and the familiarity of it was both comforting and sharpened something in her chest. The northern acres are the foundation. Pull them out, and the whole operation shrinks to a size that's survivable, but barely, and barely survivable operations have bad years. And bad years lead to debt, and debt leads to Harlan Briggs being very understanding about buying what's left. How solid is the claim, the original title? My father's title to that land is solid. He homesteaded it. He filed the paperwork himself. I've seen the original documents." She paused. "Which means Briggs has gotten someone in the county assessor's office to look the other way, or he's found a sympathetic judge, or both. The document has official letterhead, but that doesn't mean the claim is legitimate. Can you fight it? I can fight it. I need a lawyer in Clearwater who isn't connected to Briggs, which is less straightforward than it sounds because Briggs has been managing connections in Clearwater for 20 years. She looked at the document. "And I need the original title documents, which are in my father's files." In the study. She went to the study. The files were where they'd always been. Her father had been meticulous about records in the specific way of a man who'd learned young that documentation was its own form of protection. The original homestead filing, the land surveys, the title registration, she found them in the second drawer where they'd always lived, in the exact order her father had organized them, tied with the same faded brown cord. Spread them on the desk. They were solid. She could read enough of the legal language to understand that the documentation was thorough survey dates, registration numbers, county stamps that were genuine, the sequential paperwork of someone who had done this correctly from the beginning. Bram appeared in the study doorway. He'd let her go ahead alone, which she'd needed, and now he was there in the way that he was often there present without pressing. "The documentation is good," she said. "Then his claim is manufactured." "Yes." "Which means he's counting on the process being slow and expensive, and on me not having the resources to fight it through to resolution." She looked at the documents. He almost timed it right. If the drive had failed, if I'd lost the herd, I'd be coming home to this with nothing to fight with. The drive didn't fail. No, she paused. No, it didn't. Something settled in her. Not quite calm, but adjacent to it, the specific weight of a woman who had looked at a bad situation and recognized that she was not, despite everything, looking at it from a position of weakness. "I need to get to Clearwater," she said. "Find a lawyer. Get ahead of this before Briggs can move further." She looked at the window. The afternoon light was going. "Not today. Tomorrow." "I'll come," Bram said. She looked at him. "You'll want someone who's not a lawyer with you," he said. Someone who can read a room and tell you afterward what was actually being said versus what was said aloud. And, he paused briefly, I have reasons of my own for wanting to understand what Briggs is doing. What reasons? He was quiet for a moment. Not the calculating quiet of someone deciding whether to tell the truth. More the gathering quiet of someone deciding how to tell it. My last employer before I came to Silver Crown, he said. Operation called the Denton outfit, north of here, closer to the Montana border. Decent rancher. Harlan Briggs bought out the ranch next to Denton 6 years ago and started running cattle over the boundary line. Small encroachments at first. Nothing obvious. Denton complained to the county. County was polite and slow, and nothing changed. Then the water rights on Denton's East Creek were challenged. Same kind of document as this one. He nodded at the papers. Official letterhead. Shaky claim. 3 years later, Denton sold out at 40 cents on the dollar. Lenora looked at him. Briggs does this, Bram said. It's what he does. He doesn't rush. He picks the moment when the target is overextended or distracted and he moves, and then he's patient while the process works. You knew about Briggs before you came here? I knew he operated in this county. I didn't know the specific situation until after I arrived. He paused. It wasn't why I came. She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why she believed him. She had no particular reason to trust the complete transparency of a man she'd hired 3 weeks ago, but she believed him in the way she trusted his reads on cattle and weather, which was to say with the trust that came from watching someone's judgment prove accurate repeatedly under conditions that tested it. Clearwater tomorrow, she said. Clearwater tomorrow. She spent the evening with the documents, making notes in her father's old ledger, the specific claims in the county notice, the documentation that refuted them, the timeline of Briggs's approach. She was still at it when Tobin knocked on the study door at what she realized, looking at the window, was late evening. June wanted me to ask if you were eating supper, Tobin said. Lenora looked at the window. Full dark. Tell her I'll be there in 10 minutes. Elsie kept it warm. Tell Elsie thank you. He started to leave. She said Tobin. He stopped. You did the right thing. Coming to tell me about Briggs right away. That was well done. The 13-year-old had the specific reaction of a boy who'd been managing too much adult responsibility for too long and occasionally still needed to hear that he was doing it right, a brief loosening around the eyes and jaw that was gone almost. Immediately, replaced by the careful composure he'd clearly been practicing. My father would have wanted to know right away, Tobin said. So I figured you would too. He left. She sat for a moment with that and then went to supper. Clearwater was 40 miles from Silver Crown, which meant an early start and a full day's travel to get there, conduct business, and return. Lenora and Bram rode out before first light with the specific efficiency of people who'd spent the last week doing everything before first light and had stopped thinking of it as unusual. They talked on the ride. Not about the legal situation. They'd covered that the night before, and she'd said everything she needed to say about it. But the kind of talking that happened when two people who'd been through something together found that the something had created the ground for conversation that wouldn't have been possible before it. He talked about Kansas, where his children had been born. About the operation he'd worked there before Clara got sick, a decent cattle outfit on the flats where the work was steady and the pay was fair, and they'd had something approaching the settled life that Clara had wanted. About the way that had ended not dramatically, not with a single catastrophic event, but with the slow mathematics of a sick wife and medical costs and the specific generosity of a ranching community that didn't extend to covering your wages while you stayed home with your dying wife, which was the arithmetic that had turned a decent life into an itinerant one. You don't resent them for it, Lenora said. Not an accusation. Genuine observation. The rancher who didn't hold my job, some. Community, no. They weren't obligated. He rode for a moment. The ones I resent are the ones who acted obligated, who came to the house with covered dishes and sympathetic faces, and then quietly told the rancher that I'd become unreliable and he should find a replacement. Did the performance of caring and the work of abandoning at the same time. What did you do after? Took the children west. Figured the territory needed cattlemen more than it needed references. Was that the plan? Actually? He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The plan was to survive until there was space to have a plan. She understood that. She'd been doing a version of it herself for the 8 months, since her father died, managing the immediate, the urgent, the specific crises that the ranch kept producing, without much room to sit down and think about the longer trajectory. "You've been surviving in that territory for 2 years," she said. "Yes. Is there space now for the longer plan?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "There might be," he said. They rode into Clearwater mid-morning. The lawyer she wanted was named Aldous Webb, a man her father had used twice for land boundary questions, a small, precise man in his 60s who had the specific quality of someone who had been practicing law in small western towns, longing enough to know that most of the legal challenges his clients faced were primarily about who was more patient rather than who was more right. Webb's office was above the hardware store on Clearwater's main street. She'd sent word ahead with a rider the previous evening, so he was expecting her. He read the county notice. He read it again. He looked at the original title documents she'd brought. He turned them over and looked at the backs of them, which she hadn't expected, and then looked at the county stamps with a magnifying glass he took from his desk drawer. "The county notice is genuine, in the sense that the letterhead is genuine," he said. "The claim itself is not." He set the magnifying glass down. "Your father's title documentation is correct and complete. There is no defect. I know that. How do I stop the process? You file a challenge with the county court. Today, preferably, before Briggs can get any further along in whatever he's set up." Webb looked at his desktop. "The challenge requires a filing fee and an affidavit from you attesting to the documentation. I prepare the affidavit, you sign it, we file it today." He paused. "What it doesn't do immediately is stop the county from proceeding with the review. The review will continue. We're inserting ourselves into the process, not stopping the process. How long does the review take? Could be 2 months. Could be 6, during which Briggs continues to claim the title is defective. Yes, and tells his neighbors and business associates and everyone who might consider doing business with Silver Crown that the Northern Acres are under dispute." Webb looked at her. He had the face of a man who'd seen this particular play before. "Yes. Which is the real goal," Bram said. He'd been standing back from the desk. This was her business, and he'd positioned himself accordingly. But he spoke now with the quiet certainty of someone who'd been thinking while the lawyers talked. "The actual legal claim doesn't have to succeed. It just has to create enough uncertainty that Miss Whitfield's spring credit is harder to arrange, and her spring cattle contracts are complicated by questions about the land's status." Webb looked at Bram with the evaluating expression of a small-town lawyer assessing an unfamiliar voice in his office. "That's correct," Webb said, "and it's what Briggs has done before. To the Denton operation, among others." Bram and Lenora looked at each other. "You know about Denton," she said to Webb. "I know about 3 operations in this county, and the adjacent ones that have had similar notices from the county assessor's office in the past 8 years. All of them with some documented connection to Redstone Ranch's subsequent expansion." Webb folded his hands on the desktop. "I've not been able to prove a pattern to any court's satisfaction. Briggs is careful about the separation between his name and the documents." "But you believe it," Lenora said. "I believe it," Webb said plainly. "That and the filing fee won't change the legal process, but I believe it." "Then file the challenge," Lenora said, "and then tell me what else we can do." "There is one thing," Webb said. He paused, the pause of a careful man making sure he wanted to say what he was about to say. "The county assessor himself is not, I believe, the origin of these notices. He's not that sophisticated. Someone is using his office to generate documents with legitimate letterhead. If you could establish who is providing the assessor with the manufactured defect claims and document that, the challenge becomes significantly stronger." "Where would I start looking for that?" "The assessor's office keeps records of who makes formal title challenges. Those records are public. If Briggs is doing this through an intermediary, a lawyer, a land agent, someone, that person's name will be in the assessor's records as the challenging party." Webb paused. "The assessor's office is 3 doors down." Lenora looked at Bram. "I'll go," he said. "We'll both go." The assessor's office was a cramped room managed by a young clerk who looked like he'd been placed in the job recently and was still learning where everything was. He was cooperative in the specific way of someone who didn't yet know which requests he should be cautious about. Lenora asked to see the public records of title challenges on the northern Silver Crown acres. And he found them after 10 minutes of looking and set them on the counter without hesitation. She and Bram read through them side by side. The challenging party, listed in the formal record, was a land agent named Casper Veal, operating out of Clearwater, representing an unnamed client. The address listed for Veal was on the east side of town. "I know that name," Bram said quietly. She looked at him. "Veal operated in the Denton situation," he said. "I heard his name twice during that dispute. I didn't connect it until now." She looked at the name in the record. Casper Veal. A middleman, which was how Briggs operated enough separation to provide deniability, not enough that a careful person looking couldn't find the thread. She wrote the name down. They went back to Webb. Webb looked at the name, and his expression, which had been carefully neutral throughout, shifted into something that was not quite satisfaction but was close to it. "Veal," he said. "Yes, he's done this kind of work before. Careful but not invisible." Webb picked up a pen. "If you can establish that Veal's challenge was filed at Briggs's direction, a single document, a letter, a record of payment, the entire manufactured title claim collapses. The county would not only dismiss the challenge, they would have grounds to sanction whoever filed a knowingly false claim." "How do I establish that?" "That," Webb said, "is a more complicated question." They were back on the road to Silver Crown by mid-afternoon. The ride back was quieter than the ride out, not uncomfortably, just with the specific quality of two people who had gathered a significant amount of information and were digesting it independently in the same space. She was thinking about Veal and how you established a connection to Briggs when you were dealing with a man who'd spent 20 years making sure connections couldn't be established easily. She was thinking about what 6 months of a title dispute would do to Silver Crown's spring credit arrangements. She was thinking about 8,600 acres of land her father had built his life on, and the particular kind of rage that came from watching someone try to dismantle it through paperwork and patience rather than honest conflict. "He picked the wrong year," Bram said, about halfway back. She looked at him. He was counting on the drought and the drive failure, and a woman in her first year of managing a ranch alone. He had it right. That was a reasonable bet from his position. What he didn't account for was the drive not failing. The drive almost did fail. Almost isn't the same thing. He rode for a moment. "You have 864 cattle in protected winter range. Your spring position is solid. You have documentation that's sound, and a lawyer who knows the pattern. Briggs built this move for a weakened opponent. I'm still a weakened opponent. The legal fight is expensive and slow, and..." "You're not," he said. It was said simply enough that it wasn't an argument. "Just a correction." She looked at him. "The drive," he said. "Anyone in this county who follows cattle knows what that drive was. Coming home with 864 through an early blizzard in worse conditions than anyone has run that route in years. That's not a weakened rancher's story. That's a different story entirely." He paused. "Briggs timed his move for after you left. He didn't plan for what you came back as." She rode with that for a while. It wasn't vanity to recognize that he might be right. She'd been in enough negotiations and county meetings to understand that reputation was its own form of capital, and that what you came back as after a hard thing either increased or depleted that capital in ways that mattered practically. "Veal," she said. "How do you find a document connecting Veal to Briggs?" Bram was quiet for a moment. "You don't look for the document directly. You look for what Veal bought with the money Briggs paid him. Payments leave traces: bank records, land purchases, equipment. Men who do this kind of work get paid for it, and then they spend the payment on something." She looked at him. "You've thought about this before," she said. "I thought about it during the Denton situation. I was a hand, not a principal, so I couldn't act on it. But I thought about it." He paused. "I know someone in Clearwater who might know Veal's recent business. A livestock trader who knows everyone's transactions because he's involved in half of them. Would he talk? He'll talk to me. We did business 3 years ago. He owes me a favor he's never been asked to pay." He glanced at her. "Let me go back to Clearwater. Separately, without you." Two people asking is a warning. One person asking is a conversation. She thought about it. When? Day after tomorrow. I'll ride in and back in the day. She nodded slowly. The ranch gate appeared ahead of them in the early evening light, and at the gate, exactly as she had predicted, 2 days ago, over a dying fire in the Winter Range Valley, a small figure was standing on the bottom rail, waving. Bram made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You called it, he said. I did, Lenora said. She was smiling, which she noticed because she hadn't been expecting to. They rode through the gate, and June jumped down from the rail and ran for her father again. And this time when Bram caught her, he spun once, just once, before setting her down a small thing, entirely unguarded, the specific joy of a man who was home and knew it. Lenora dismounted and handed Colt to the stable hand and stood for a moment in the cold evening air of her father's ranch, the ranch that Harlan Briggs thought he was already halfway to owning. She looked at the northern pastures, at the solid dark of the stone fence line her father had built 30 years ago, at the house that was lit from inside with the specific warm light of a house that had people in it. She was not done. She was, in fact, just beginning. Bram rode to Clearwater 2 days later, alone, before the rest of the ranch was fully awake. Lenora heard him leave the specific sound of a single horse moving out at that hour, quiet and deliberate, different from the noise of a full outfit departing. She was already at the study desk with her father's records and Webb's notes spread in front of her, working through what she knew and what she still needed, and she listened to the hoofbeats fade down the road toward town and then went back to the documents. She'd been doing this for 2 days. Not obsessively, she had a ranch to run, winter preparations that couldn't wait for legal situations to resolve themselves, cattle check schedules to organize and supply inventories to complete, and a dozen smaller things that accumulated in the management of a large operation, regardless of what else was happening. But she'd been returning to the documents in the mornings and the evenings, building the picture of what Briggs had done and how he'd done it, and where the vulnerabilities in his manufactured claim actually were. The more she looked, the more she saw a pattern that was almost elegant in its patience. Briggs hadn't rushed. He never rushed. He'd been watching Silver Crown since before her father died. She could see it now, looking backward, in the specific timing of certain things. The grazing lease inquiry from a Redstone agent 18 months ago that her father had dismissed as routine. The water rights conversation at a county meeting that Amos had mentioned in passing without thinking much of it. Small probings, testing the boundaries of the operation, looking for the place where pressure would be most effective. When her father died, Briggs had recalibrated. A woman inheriting a major cattle operation in 1886 was, in Harlan Briggs's assessment, an operation entering a period of vulnerability. He'd been right about the vulnerability. He'd been wrong about the woman. She found that she was almost grateful for the precision of his miscalculation. The morning passed in the specific productive quiet of a ranch house where the children had learned, over 2 weeks, the natural rhythms of the place and had fit themselves into them. Tobin was in the barn. He went to the barn every morning now, working alongside the hands with a seriousness that the older ranch hands had started responding to with the specific respect they reserved for people who showed up consistently and didn't need to be managed. Elsie was in the kitchen with Martha, where an arrangement of mutual usefulness had developed that seemed to satisfy both parties. Reed had attached himself to the ranch's part-time veterinarian during the drive preparations and had somehow maintained that attachment on the man's twice-weekly visits, following him through every examination with the quiet intensity of a child who had found the thing he intended to do with his life. June came to the study at mid-morning. She didn't knock. Knocking was a concept June acknowledged in theory but found optional in practice. She came in, looked at the papers on the desk, looked at Lenora, and climbed into the armchair in the corner that had been her father's reading chair and sat in it with her feet not quite reaching the floor. "Are you worried?" June asked. "I'm working," Lenora said. "That's not what I asked." Lenora looked at her, 6 years old, entirely serious. Lenora said. June considered this with the gravity of someone processing an important answer. "My papa says worry is just thinking that forgot to bring a plan." Lenora looked at the child. "Your papa said that?" "When I was scared about the storm. While you were gone, June picked at a thread on the chair arm. I was scared the storm would get you. It didn't. I know, because he said it wouldn't. June looked up. He said you were smart enough to get through it. He said that specifically. Something moved through Lenora that she didn't quite examine. He was generous to say so, she said. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean, June said, with the absolute confidence of someone who had been taking a person's measure for 6 years and had arrived at firm conclusions. He's not like that. Lenora knew that. She'd known it since the list on the back of the envelope. On the first morning, the specific honesty of a man who said what he found without softening it into what you wanted to hear. Go help Elsie, Lenora said. Or find Reed. Don't make Martha feed you lunch without contributing something first. June slid off the chair. At the door she stopped. Miss Whitfield. Yes. Are you going to make us leave? The question landed with the directness that only very young children manage. No build-up, no hedging, just the thing itself. Lenora looked at her. No, she said. June looked at her for a moment, with the evaluating attention she'd apparently inherited from her father. Okay, she said, and left. Lenora sat for a moment with the empty study and the documents and the specific weight of a 6-year-old's question asked in complete earnestness, and then she went back to work. Bram came back from Clearwater in the late afternoon, later than she'd expected, which told her something before he said a word. He came straight to the house, handed his horse to the stable hand without the usual check of the animal he always did after a hard ride, and came into the study where she'd been waiting, without quite admitting she was waiting. He sat down across from the desk. He had the look of a man who had found what he went looking for and was sorting out what to do with it. Tell me, she said. The livestock trader's name is Hector Bruns. He knows every transaction in the county, because he's in half of them. You were right about that. Or Webb was. Bram put his hat on the desk, which he rarely did, which meant he'd been wearing it for a long time and was tired. Veal, Briggs's land agent, made 3 significant purchases in October. 2 months ago, a land parcel east of Clearwater, a new wagon, and a bank deposit that Bruns knew about through a mutual acquaintance at the Clearwater Bank. He paused. Deposit was $700. Lenora was still. Bruns knows the deposit because the mutual acquaintance mentioned it. The amount was unusual for Veal, who is not a prosperous man normally. It came in on October 3rd. Bram looked at her. Your title notice is dated October 9th. 6 days. Bruns will testify to what he knows, she said. Bruns will write it down. He won't testify in court. He has his own business reasons for not wanting to be in Redstone's path, but he'll write a signed statement of what he knows. His acquaintance at the bank may do more. Bram paused. The bank acquaintance is a man named Fowler. He doesn't like Briggs. Has his own reasons for that which I didn't ask about. Fowler said if he were asked formally by a lawyer, in writing he would confirm that the deposit originated from a Redstone Ranch account. Lenora absorbed this. A payment from Redstone to Veal 6 days before the manufactured title notice. If Fowler would confirm the origin of the funds, and Bruns would document the timing, and Webb could connect that to the assessor's office records showing Veal as the challenging party, the chain was incomplete, but it was real. It was the kind of evidence that, in the hands of the right lawyer before the right county official, made a fraudulent claim collapse under its own weight. Webb, she said, I need to get this to Webb today. I know. I brought a written summary from Bruns. He wrote it out while I was there. It's in my coat. He stood, went to the door, came back with a folded paper. Bruns's handwriting isn't elegant, but the content is clear. She read it. It was clear. You did well, she said. Bruns did well. I just asked the right questions. She looked at him over the paper. He was being factually modest in the way that made false modesty look like what it was. He'd gone to a man he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, reconstructed a relationship with exactly the leverage available to him, and come back with something that materially changed their position in a legal fight that 2 days ago had felt slow and expensive and uncertain. I'll ride to Clearwater tomorrow, she said. Take this to Webb. Take the Bruns statement and the bank connection. Let Webb decide how to use it. I know how to work with a lawyer. I know you do, not an apology, not a retreat, just an acknowledgement. They looked at each other for a moment across her father's desk. Bram, she said, She hadn't planned to say anything further. But the study was quiet and the light was going, and the day had had the specific quality of a day in which things shifted incrementally, irreversibly toward something, and she was aware of it in a way that made silence feel insufficient. "Children," she said. "June came in this morning. She asked if I was going to make them leave." He was very still. "What did you tell her?" he said. "I told her no." He looked at the desk, the hat, the Brunn statement in her hand. "She worries about that," he said, "more than the others. She was young enough when Clara died that she doesn't have the full memory of stability before. What she knows is afterward. The moving. She remembers Kansas? Bits of it. Marble the cat. The kitchen. She doesn't remember the house as home the way the older ones do." He paused. "She attaches fast. It's a response to the instability she finds a place, and she decides it's home because she can't afford to be uncertain about it." "She's decided this is home," Lenora said. "Yes," he looked up. "I should have warned you about that. I don't need warning about a 6-year-old who likes my house." "She's not," he stopped. Started again. "She doesn't just like the house. She likes you. That's different. When June decides someone matters, she commits to it completely and without reservation. And if it doesn't work out the way she's committed to, it takes her a long time to recover." He was being careful in the way of a parent laying out a genuine risk. "I don't say that to pressure you into anything. I say it because you should know what's actually happening when she asks you those questions." Lenora looked at him. "I know what's happening," she said. Told her no. "I meant it." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said quietly. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It had the density of something that both of them were aware of, and neither was moving toward directly, because direct movement toward it would require naming it, and naming it would require both of them to be ready for what came after the name. And neither of them was quite there yet. Or perhaps both of them were, but neither wanted to be wrong about the other. It was Dale Cutler who interrupted it, coming to the study door on his crutch, looking between them with the specific neutrality of a man who'd walked into a room where something was being not said and had the grace to address only what was visible. "Miss Whitfield." Ryder came in from the south pasture. "3 animals down in the lower field. Looks like they didn't come through the cold snap as well as we thought." She was on her feet immediately. This was the ranch, pulling her back to the ranch, which was always the ranch's way. "I'll come," she said. She looked at Bram briefly as she moved past him. "Clearwater tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. She went with Dale. The 3 animals in the lower field were manageable, not lost, as she'd feared, just weakened, in the way that older cattle weakened in the first hard cold of winter, requiring supplemental feed and shelter and monitoring. She spent 2 hours in the lower field with Sanchez and one of the young hands, moving the animals to the stone shelter at the field's east end and getting feed to them and making sure they had unfrozen water. It was ordinary ranch work, unglamorous, cold, smelling of cattle and wet hay. She did it without resentment and without romance. It was what the work was, and the work was what Silver Crown was, and Silver Crown was what she'd chosen to be the full architecture of her life. That choice had been made long before her father died, long before she'd sat in his study looking at ledgers. It had been made the first time she'd ridden out at dawn and felt the specific satisfaction of land that was working, cattle that were healthy, a ranch that was paying its hands and its debt and producing something real. She'd known she could lose it. She'd known it the day her father was buried, looking at the men around the grave who were already calculating. She wasn't losing it. The following morning she rode to Clearwater with the Brunn statement in her coat pocket and met with Aldous Webb for 2 hours. Webb read the Brunn statement. He read it twice. He looked at the bank information and asked several specific questions about Fowler and how Bram had come to speak with him and what exactly Fowler had said versus what had been inferred. Lenora answered the questions carefully and completely. Webb put the papers together and held them in both hands for a moment in a way that reminded her of a man weighing something. "This is enough," he said. "Not for a criminal proceeding, not yet. But for the county challenge. This is enough to file a formal response that will put the assessor's office on notice that the title challenge originated in a payment from Redstone to Veal, and that we have the documentation to establish that in court." He set the papers down. When an assessor's office is told directly that they've been used to process a fraudulent filing and that there is specific evidence of payment, they have two options. They can ignore it and accept the legal exposure that comes with that, or they can dismiss the challenge and distance themselves from the situation. Which will they do? The current assessor has 2 years left in his term and a pension he cares about, Webb said. He'll dismiss the challenge. And Briggs? Webb was quiet for a moment. Briggs loses this round. He'll know you have Fowler and Bruns. He'll pull back. He has enough legal sophistication to know when a manufactured claim has been exposed. He paused. That doesn't mean he's done. Men like Briggs don't stop. They recalibrate. I know. She'd known that since the Denton story. But right now I need the northern acres secured so I can go into spring without a cloud on my title. File this today, and you'll have that within 6 weeks. My estimate. File today. He filed that afternoon. She rode back to Silver Crown in the late afternoon of a day that had gone gray and cold, but without the specific threat of the earlier storms, just winter settling in for its duration. The long cold that was predictable and manageable in a way that the early blizzard had not been. When she came through the ranch gate, she found an unexpected scene in the near yard. Bram was working with Tobin on roping technique. This was not unexpected. She'd seen them do this before, but standing 10 feet away, watching with their arms folded, in near-identical postures were Gallagher and Sanchez, both of whom were experienced ropers themselves and were watching Bram's instruction with the attentive skepticism of people who suspected they might be learning something and weren't quite ready to admit it. Bram was talking Tobin through a swing correction, quietly, with the patient repetition of someone who understood that physical skills required the same instruction delivered multiple ways before the body absorbed it. Tobin was listening and trying and getting it wrong in slightly different ways each time, which was actually how you learned the slightly different wrong was the path to eventually right. She dismounted and watched for a moment from a distance. Gallagher noticed her. He started to straighten, the instinctive adjustment of an employee noticing the employer, and she made a small gesture that meant don't, and he relaxed back into his observation. Bram didn't notice her yet. He was focused on Tobin. You're fighting the rope, Bram said. Don't try to control the spin. Let it spin and control where you're standing relative to it. It's the same thing, Tobin said, with 13-year-old certainty. It's not. Try it again. Tobin tried it again. It was better. There, Bram said. You feel the difference? Maybe. That's enough for now. Do it 500 more times and you'll stop saying maybe. Gallagher said to Sanchez, at a volume he might have intended to be private, he's not wrong about the stance. He's right about the stance, Sanchez said slightly less quietly. I've been fighting the spin for 15 years. Bram heard this. He turned, saw Gallagher and Sanchez, saw Lenora behind them, and his expression cycled through something brief and unreadable before settling back into its usual composure. Miss Whitfield, he said, how did it go in Clearwater? Webb's filed today. He expects the challenge dismissed within 6 weeks. She watched something move through him, not relief exactly, but the specific settling of a person who has been holding a weight and has had a portion of it removed. Good, he said. It's not over, she said. Briggs will recalibrate. But not for a while. But not for a while. Gallagher and Sanchez, reading the room with the accuracy of men who'd spent years around horses and cattle, and therefore around nonverbal communication, made departing sounds and went to find other things to do. Tobin looked between Lenora and his father with the specific awareness of a 13-year-old who was old enough to notice things and young enough to not have developed the poker face that would have hidden his noticing. Supper's in an hour, Bram told him. Go find Reed. Tobin went. They were left in the yard in the late afternoon cold, the horses put away, the ranch sounds around them, going through the evening shift from work noise to settling noise. 6 weeks, Bram said. 6 weeks for the title. The broader situation with Briggs. She paused. Webb says he doesn't stop, he recalibrates, I know. Which means I need to be thinking about what he does next. You've been thinking about that. Yes. She looked at the northern pastures, the fence line, the clean cold sky above the mountain ridge. He'll look for another pressure point. Not the title that's exposed now. He knows we can fight it. Something else. Water rights, Bram said. It's the next logical lever. Your east springs feed the northern range. If someone questions the origin point of those springs, I've thought about the water rights. She looked at him. I've also thought about the fact that I have documentation for everything my father ever did on this land. Every survey, every filing, every registration. She paused. And I have a record now of what Briggs does and how he does it, and evidence of his method that a county court has seen. Precedent, Bram said. If he comes at the water rights, we're not starting from nothing. We're starting from a demonstrated pattern. She paused. Webb's word, not mine. Demonstrated pattern is harder to move against than an isolated challenge. Bram nodded. They stood for a moment in the yard. Bram, she said. He looked at her. You've been here 6 weeks, she said. The drive is done. The immediate situation is not resolved, but manageable. The arrangement we made at the gate was for the drive. It was very still. I'm not asking you to leave, she said. She said it clearly, without hedging, because hedging would have been dishonest. I'm saying the original terms are not the terms anymore, and I think we both know that, and I'd rather say it directly than leave it hanging over both of us. What terms are you proposing, he said. His voice was even. But he was watching her the way he watched terrain carefully, fully. Foreman, she said, Dale won't be back to full capacity until spring, and even then he's getting older. He knows it. We've talked about it. She paused. The role needs someone who can do what you do. Not just the cattle work, the judgment, the seeing what's coming before it arrives. He was quiet. The children stay, she said. That's not a condition, that's a statement of fact. They stay because this is working, and it would be damage to stop it. That's a large decision, he said. For you. I'm aware of that. Lenora. It was the first time he'd used her name without the miss in front of it. He didn't seem to notice he'd done it. I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. 'Cause I can hear it as a business proposition, and I can also hear it as something else, and I'd rather not assume. She looked at him directly. Both, she said, simultaneously. I'm not going to pretend they're separate. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she started doing the arithmetic of whether she'd misread something fundamental, which was an uncomfortable calculation. I have nothing to bring to this arrangement, he said finally. In material terms. You know that. You brought 864 cattle through an early blizzard over a mountain pass with 8 riders, she said. Think we've established what you bring. That's minus. Bram. She said it the same way he'd said her name without the formal distance, just the name itself. I have been running this ranch alone for 8 months. I have done it adequately. I could continue doing it adequately. She paused. I don't want to continue doing it alone. That is also true, and I'm choosing to say it plainly because I think you're a person who responds better to plain things than to managed ones. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. Yes to which part? Yes to all of it. He said it the way he said most things without embellishment, but with a solidity that meant it. The foreman position, the staying, a pause. The other thing. She felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't realized had been held tight. The wages I quoted are fair, she said, because she was still partly a woman who ran a ranch and the practical mattered. The wages are more than fair, he said. Then we're in agreement. We're in agreement. It was, she thought, probably the least romantic formal agreement in the county's history, and she was entirely fine with that, because the lack of romance was itself a form of honesty that she valued more than the performance would have been worth. But then Bram stepped forward, and there was a moment, not long, just long enough where neither of them was thinking about wages or legal challenges or cattle counts, and the evening cold and the yard and the ranch sounds fell away to just the specific fact of 2 people who had decided something. And when he stepped back, his expression had the quality of something settled and warm and carefully held. Supper's in an hour, she said. You told that to Tobin. I'm telling you too. He almost smiled. The real one, not the shadow. They went inside. Winter came to Silver Crown, the way winter came to Wyoming, without apology and without mercy, the cold settling into the land like something permanent that had been temporarily displaced and had come back to its own. Cattle in the winter range held. Lenora ran the January check Bram had suggested, pulling 4 animals that needed supplemental shelter, losing none. The northern pasture fence held. The East Springs ran clear under their ice edge. Aldous Webb sent a letter in the second week of January. The county assessor had dismissed the title challenge on the grounds of insufficient documentation and procedural irregularity. The northern 12,000 acres remained exactly where they had always been in the documentation of Silver Crown Ranch, registered in the name of Amos Whitfield, transferred by succession to Lenora Whitfield, unclouded. She read the letter at the study desk and then set it down carefully in the center of the desk blotter, where her father had always put things that he considered important. She didn't whoop. She didn't do anything dramatic. She sat with it for a moment and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing that had threatened to undo everything being reduced, through patience and careful work and the right people, to a piece of paper that said it had failed. Then she went to find Bram. He was in the barn with Tobin there always. Now and she stood in the barn doorway and said, "Webb's letter came." He looked at her. "The challenge is dismissed," she said. Tobin looked between them with 13-year-old attentiveness. "Good," Bram said. "That's all you're going to say?" "What else is there to say? We did the work. Webb did the work." Worked. He turned back to what he'd been doing, which was examining a harness buckle that had been causing problems. The east fence on the north pasture still needs reinforcement before spring. "I was thinking tomorrow." She looked at him. At the harness buckle. At Tobin, who had the suppressed expression of someone finding the situation funnier than he was going to admit. "Tomorrow," she said. "Early," Bram said, "before the temperature drops again." She went back to the house. She was smiling by the time she reached the kitchen door, and she didn't entirely try to stop it. February came, and Harlan Briggs did not send another notice, which was itself a form of information. Webb had been right that the exposed pattern changed Briggs's calculation. He wasn't gone. He would never entirely be gone. But he was recalibrating, as Webb had predicted, looking for the next leverage point, while the current one sat filed and dismissed in the county court. She was ready for the next leverage point. The ranch ran. Cattle in Winter Range held their condition. The children moved through Silver Crown with the specific ease of people who had stopped bracing for the moment when they would be required to leave. Reed came home from the veterinarian's twice-weekly visit, one February afternoon, with a careful expression and said to Lenora, "Doctor, Hennessy says I have a real feel for it. He said that specifically." "He's right," she said. Reed looked at her, as if checking for the sincerity and finding it, and not quite knowing what to do with it. "Okay," he said, and went to find Tobin. Elsie asked Lenora, one evening at the kitchen table, if there was a particular method Silver Crown used for the breeding records, because she'd found the existing system a bit hard to follow. Lenora explained it. Elsie listened, and then proposed a modification that was, Lenora had to acknowledge, genuinely more logical than her father's system. They implemented it together over 2 evenings. June stopped asking if they were going to leave. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It wasn't an announcement or a single moment. It was the kind of change that you noticed in retrospect, looking back over a week or 2 weeks, and realizing that the question had stopped appearing. June still followed Lenora through the house sometimes, still showed up in the study at inopportune moments, still asked questions about everything, with complete disregard for whether the questions were convenient. But the specific anxious question was gone. Bram noticed it the same day Lenora did. They were in the study in the evening. This had become the routine. After supper, the two of them with the ranch accounts or the spring plans or the maps, the work that was also, incrementally, something more than work, and Bram said, out of no apparent preceding conversation, she stopped asking. Lenora looked up. "June," he said. She stopped asking if we're leaving. "I know," Lenora said. "I noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. He said it the way he said the things that mattered without performance, directly, as if the directness was the respect. "She did it herself," Lenora said. "I just stopped giving her a reason to need to ask." He looked at her across the desk in the lamplight of the study in the deep Wyoming winter, the maps of Silver Crown spread between them, the sound of the wind outside doing what Wyoming wind did. And his expression had the quality of something fully made up, fully committed to, fully at rest with itself. "That's not a small thing," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." Outside, the winter range held the cattle safe. The north pasture fence stood against the cold, and inside the house that had been too large for one person, the lamps were lit in every room. Spring came to Silver Crown the way it always came to that part of Wyoming reluctantly, in arguments with winter, giving ground and then taking it back. Warm days followed by cold nights that reminded you that the season hadn't fully committed yet and wasn't going to be rushed. Came. By late March, the snow on the lower pastures had pulled back to the north-facing slopes, and the first green was showing in the valley grass, not the full green of May, just the tentative early color that meant the land was still alive under everything winter had done to it. The cattle in the winter range were moving differently, the specific increased energy of animals that could smell the season changing and wanted to move toward it. Lenora had been watching the herd condition daily since February, and the numbers were better than she'd let herself hope in the hardest part of January. She was doing the spring count Bram on a Tuesday morning in the first week of April, when Dale Cutler came out to the near pasture on his horse, walking it carefully, because his legs still told him about the weather before the weather arrived, and said that there was a rider at the gate from Redstone. Lenora and Bram looked at each other. "Briggs himself?" she said to Dale. "No, ma'am. A young hand. He's carrying a letter." She handed her count notebook to Bram and rode back to the gate. The Redstone hand was about 20, with the specific careful posture of someone who'd been told to deliver a message and not get drawn into conversation about it. He handed her the envelope and waited. She opened it at the gate. The letter was from Harlan Briggs, written in his own hand. She'd seen his signature on enough county documents to recognize it. 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph noted that the county's dismissal of the title challenge had been noted and respected. The second paragraph stated that Redstone Ranch was prepared to make an offer to purchase Silver Crown's eastern water rights at a figure he named, which was fair by any honest measure, not generous, but fair. She read it twice. Then she looked at the Redstone hand. "Tell Mr. Briggs that Miss Whitfield received the letter and will respond through her legal representative," she said. Kept her voice even, and her face neutral, the way she'd learned to do in the early months after her father died, whenever a county meeting was an exercise in not showing the men across the table how young she felt. The hand nodded and rode back toward Redstone. She rode back to where Bram was waiting. She handed him the letter without explanation. He read it and handed it back. "He's changed tactics," Bram said. "He's making a legitimate offer," which is the next phase of the same strategy. He can't take the water rights through a manufactured claim, not after what happened with the title challenge. So now he buys them. Legal, clean, documented. And then in 3 years, when he controls the water source for your North Range, he's in a better negotiating position for the next thing. "I know," she said. "Are you going to sell?" "No," she folded the letter. "But I need to respond in a way that closes this door, without making an enemy of a man I can't afford to make into a worse enemy than he already is." "Webb," Bram said. "Webb," she agreed. She wrote to Webb that afternoon, describing the offer and her intention to decline. Webb's response came 4 days later, a draft letter that was polite and legally precise and communicated a firm no in language that left no room for misinterpretation, while also leaving no emotional opening for Briggs to characterize as hostile. She signed it and sent it through the county mail. Briggs did not respond. He didn't send another offer. He didn't send another notice. He didn't appear at county meetings in the specific proximity to Lenora that she'd become accustomed to reading as a form of presence marking. He was simply, for the first time since she'd inherited Silver Crown, not pressing. Webb, when she mentioned this in a letter, wrote back, "A man who has tested a fence in several places and found it solid will typically spend some time looking for a different fence. This is not resolution. It is, however, a rest." She was willing to accept a rest. Spring calf count came in at 614. She was standing in the east pasture with the tally in her hand when the number resolved, and she stood still for a moment with it. 614 calves from a herd that had come through a drought year and an early blizzard and a 40-mile drive through mountain terrain in worse conditions than anyone had run that route in recent memory. Her father's best spring count had been 580, from a larger herd under better conditions. Bram was beside her. 614, she said. "I heard Sanchez's count." "Yes." She looked at the pasture. Calves were, in the way of calves, simultaneously fragile and ridiculous, all legs and uncertainty, and the specific energy of creatures that had only recently discovered they had legs and weren't entirely sure what to do with them. The mothers moved around them with the focused attention of animals that knew exactly what mattered. My father would have said something understated, she said. Something like not bad for a rough year. And then he would have gone to the study and sat with it for an hour and not talked to anyone. Not bad for a rough year, Bram said. She looked at him. He would have been right, Bram said. She laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly, the genuine laugh of someone caught off guard by something that was actually funny. And Bram had the expression of a man who had aimed for exactly that and was satisfied with the result. Not bad, she said. Spring work on a cattle ranch after a hard winter was the kind of work that left no room for anything that wasn't the work. Fences that had shifted under snow load needed repair. Water points needed clearing. The spring branding took a full week with every available hand working long days, including Tobin, who at 14 could be counted on for real work and was counted on accordingly and seemed to have quietly decided this was the correct arrangement. The breeding stock rotation required decisions that Lenora made with Bram in the evenings, reviewing Elsie's updated records. The modified system she and Lenora had developed over the winter had proven itself in the spring accounting, cleaner and easier to read than the old method, and Lenora found herself showing it to Dale with something approaching pride. Dale had reviewed it with characteristic care and said, "That Mercer girl has a head for organization." "She does," Lenora said. "Good thing somebody in this outfit does," Dale said, which was as close to a compliment as Dale generally managed. The neighboring ranchers came to Silver Crown in the spring in ways they hadn't come before the drive. Not Briggs, but the others, men who had declined to lone riders in the fall, who had watched from their own operations and waited to see whether the wealthy widow would manage or fail, came, one by one, in the way that people who have made a miscalculation come when they're ready to quietly correct it. They came with proposals. Some wanted to discuss a shared water management agreement for the Northern Creek system. One wanted to talk about a cooperative buying arrangement for winter feed that would benefit both operations in a hard year. Another came simply, as it seemed, to be seen being there, to establish that he was the kind of neighbor who came to Silver Crown. She received them all in the study. She offered coffee. She listened to what they actually wanted and negotiated from a position that was, for the first time since her father died, genuinely secure. The county knew what had happened at Blackstone Pass. Word had moved the way, word moved in ranch country through every general store conversation and feed supply exchange and county meeting, until the story of Silver Crown's fall drive had taken on the specific texture of local legend, which meant it was probably 40% embellished, but remained accurate in its essential facts. Lenora Whitfield had taken 900 cattle through an early blizzard over a mountain pass with 8 riders, and come home with most of the herd. And the man she'd hired to lead the drive had done something that experienced drovers in the county were still discussing around their own fires in terms of respect. She didn't entirely love being a legend. It had a quality of distance to it that she found slightly uncomfortable, the way people looked at her in Clearwater sometimes, with the specific appraisal that meant they were seeing the story rather than the person. But she understood it was useful, in the way that many uncomfortable things were useful, and she took it for what it was. The offer that came from Grayson Wells, the largest cattleman in the adjacent county, arrived in May. Wells wanted Bram. Not in a hostile way. Wells was not Briggs. He was a straightforward businessman who had heard about the drive and made a direct calculation. He wrote to Lenora first, which was its own form of respect, explaining that he was prepared to offer Bram Mercer a foreman position at his main operation at a wage that was significantly more than Silver Crown was paying, plus a house on the Wells property and a land parcel of his own in 5 years. She read the letter and held it for a while before she said anything to Bram about it. She held it for almost 2 days, not because she was considering it on his behalf, that wasn't her decision, but because she was thinking about what it meant that Wells had written to her first, and what it meant that her first response to reading it had been something that she recognized honestly as fear. Not the specific actionable fear of a threat she could meet. The other kind. The kind that told you what you were actually invested in. She gave Bram the letter over supper on the second evening. He read it at the table, folded it. Set it down, Wells, he said. He's a straightforward man. The offer is genuine. I know his reputation. Bram looked at the letter. The wages are better. Yes, the land parcel is real. He follows through on that kind of promise. I've known men who worked for him. I know. He looked at her. Lenora, he said. Are you asking me to stay? She met his eyes. I'm asking what you want, she said. Not the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. The supper sounds around them, Tobin and Reed in some kind of low-grade argument about something. Elsie asking Martha a kitchen question. June's voice from the other room, something at length, to no one in particular, continued as the background of an ordinary evening. He stopped. Started again, with the care of a man who had learned the hard way that words said without precision had consequences. I want what we've been building here, not the wages. Not the position. He paused. You know that. I need to hear it clearly. I'm staying, he said, if you're asking. Not because I need the employment. Because I want what's here. She looked at him. Then write to Wells and thank him, she said. And tell him no. I will. He picked up the letter. The land parcel was genuinely appealing, though. I know, she said, which is why I waited 2 days before showing it to you. He looked at her with the expression that was the real smile, the one that wasn't suppressed. You were worried I'd take it, he said. I was considering the possibility. And I decided that if you took it, that would tell me something important. And if you didn't, that would tell me something important. And either way, I needed to know. She paused. I've been running this ranch by making clear-eyed assessments of the information in front of me. I wasn't going to stop because the information was personal. He was quiet for a moment. That, he said, is the most you thing you've ever said. Is that a complaint? No, he said, it's genuinely not. He wrote to Wells the following morning. The letter was brief and grateful and final. What happened next was not a single moment, but a series of them, accumulating the way things accumulated in a life that was being built incrementally rather than arranged. There was an evening in late May when the work of the day had finished early enough that there was actual light left, and they sat on the porch, all 6 of them, which had become an occasional thing, comfortable end-of-day sitting that happened when everything that needed doing had been done, and June was telling a story about something Marble the cat had done in Kansas that grew more elaborate with each retelling. And Reed was arguing about a detail that he claimed to remember differently, and Tobin was affecting the tolerant patience of an older brother who had heard this story many times. And Elsie was laughing at something Martha had said from inside the kitchen. And the light was the specific gold of a Wyoming late spring evening that made everything look slightly more significant than ordinary. Bram said quietly, so only she could hear, Clara would have liked this place. Lenora looked at him. The mountains, he said. She always wanted to see the real mountains. He said it without grief, exactly more with the quality of someone holding something carefully, not putting it down but not being held down by it either. She would have liked you. I think that often. She didn't know what to do with that except receive it honestly. I think I would have liked her, Lenora said. He nodded. They sat with that for a while in the gold light. There was the morning in June when Dale Cutler came to the study and stood in the doorway. With his hat in his hands, he was on 2 feet now, the crutch gone, though the leg still gave him trouble in cold weather, and said that he wanted to talk about the future of his position. You're not thinking of leaving, Lenora said. It wasn't quite a question. No, ma'am. I'm thinking of being honest about what I can and can't do. Dale turned his hat in his hands. Mercer runs this outfit better than I did, and I was good at my job. That's not easy to say, and it's true. He paused. I'd like to stay on in a reduced capacity. Mentoring the young hands, managing the supply accounts. What I can do without putting myself back on that slope with a horse. That's what I'd like too, she said. If you're willing. Dale's face did the thing it did when he was relieved and didn't want to show it. Then that's what we'll do. There was the afternoon in July when Reed came back from doctor. Hennessy's with a proposition. The doctor wanted to take him on as a formal apprentice, starting the following year, working toward the kind of certification that would let Reed practice as a livestock doctor in his own right. Reed presented this to Lenora with the controlled excitement of a boy, trying not to seem as excited as he was. "What does your father say?" Lenora asked. "He said it's my decision and I should talk to you." "Why to me?" Reed looked at her with an expression that had something of his father's specific directness in it. "Because this is our home," he said, "and decisions about the future of the home are something you're part of." She was quiet for a moment. "Say yes to Dr. Hensey," she said. Reed's controlled excitement became briefly uncontrolled, and then was controlled again. "Thank you," he said, with 13-year-old dignity, and walked out of the study at a speed that was not quite running. She sat in the study after he left and thought about the word he'd used. Home, not Miss Whitfield's ranch, not the place they were staying. Home. She didn't cry about it. She sat with it and let it be what it was. The wedding was in August, beneath the cottonwoods beside the ranch house, on a Saturday that arrived after 2 weeks of good weather and delivered on the weather's implicit promise blue sky. Reasonable wind. Kind of summer day Wyoming offered without apology when it was in the mood to be generous. It was small. That was her choice, and Bram's choice both, made without discussion because they'd come to it independently and found they'd arrived at the same place. The Silver Crown hands, Dale, Webb, a few of the neighboring ranchers whose spring visits had become something approaching genuine relationship. Martha Vane, who wore her best dress and managed not to express any opinion about anything she might have had opinions about, which was its own form of affection. Children. Tobin stood straight through the whole thing with the bearing of a young man taking something seriously. Elsie had, without being asked, organized the food for the small gathering afterward with a precision that would not have shamed a professional caterer. Reed stood next to Tobin and spent portions of the ceremony watching a hawk circling over the north pasture, which was Reed being Reed, and no one expected otherwise. June wore a dress that she had strong opinions about and had negotiated with Martha about for 3 days, and she stood at the front where she could see everything, and at one point, during the exchange of the formal words she said, at a volume slightly above private but below disruptive, "This is the part where it's official, to no one in particular," which was June being June. Lenora heard it. Bram heard it. They both kept their faces composed in the specific way of people suppressing something that was going to come out later, anyway. After, in the easier noise of the gathering, when people had food and the formal moment had broken into ordinary conversation, Lenora found herself standing near the cottonwoods with Dale, who was watching the whole scene with the specific expression of a man who had seen a lot and was considering what he was seeing now. "Your father would have approved of him," Dale said. It was as close to ceremonial sentiment as Dale got, which meant it was genuine. "I know," she said. "He would have asked me what I thought first." "I would have told him what I thought." "What would you have told him?" Dale looked across the yard to where Bram was talking to Gallagher and Hayes, with the ease of someone who had become a natural center of the operation he was managing. "I would have told him that the man came to this ranch with nothing but 4 children and 30 years of knowing cattle, and that he handled both the cattle and the children, and the whole damn situation as well as I've ever seen anyone handle anything." Dale paused. "And that the children are the proof. You want to know what a man is? You look at what his children become. Those 4 would make anyone proud." "They would," she said. "They already do," Dale said, and turned to get more coffee, which was as much ceremony as he was going to manage. Harlan Briggs sent a note in September. It was brief and formal and congratulatory on the marriage, which she read as what it was: the specific acknowledgement of a man who had been paying attention and had revised his assessment of the situation. Briggs was a realist. He had looked at Silver Crown, the spring calf count, the cleared title, the partnerships with neighboring ranchers that had developed over the summer, the foreman who had driven 900 cattle through a mountain blizzard and was now a permanent part of the operation. And he had concluded what a realist concluded when the math changed. There would be other moments, other pressure. She didn't believe otherwise. But for now, the note was what it was: an acknowledgement, a recalibration. A man choosing his battles and deciding for the moment that this was not one. She wrote back 2 sentences, thanked him, wished Redstone well in the coming season. Webb, when she described this exchange in a letter, wrote, Maintaining civil correspondence with an adversary who has chosen to pause is sound practice. It costs nothing and preserves options. Well done. She appreciated Webb. What the year had done to Silver Crown was not the same as what the year had done to the people in it, though the two were harder to separate than she'd expected. The ranch was stronger demonstrably, in the numbers and the standing and the spring count, and the cleared title and the relationships with neighbors that had not existed 8 months ago. That was the visible record. But the visible record didn't fully account for what she'd learned about the land she'd inherited, which was that it had not been complete when she got it, though she hadn't known that. Her father had built something real. 30 years of unglamorous, honest work had built Silver Crown into what it was. She had maintained it, learned it, fought for it, and brought it through a year that had been designed by drought and weather, and a man who had counted on her, failing to break it. But there was a version of Silver Crown that her father's work had left undone, not because of any failure on his part, but because the missing pieces were the specific kind of thing that a man running a ranch alone couldn't build for himself. And Amos Whitfield had been a man running a ranch that had slowly, quietly become a place where only work lived. What Bram had brought was not just the cattle knowledge, though that was real and had mattered and had saved the herd. What the Mercer family had brought was something less quantifiable and more fundamental. They had brought the noise of a house that had children in it. They had brought the specific gravity of people who needed things to matter, who needed the place to be more than an operation, who needed it to be somewhere you came back to. June asking if she had children, Reed wanting to stay because it was home. Tobin standing straight at the wedding like a young man who understood that this moment was one of the ones that counted. Elsie's breeding records, neater than anything Silver Crown had ever kept. These were the things that Lenora hadn't known she was missing, partly because you couldn't fully know what you were missing until the missing thing was present and you could see the shape of the absence it had been filling. She thought about this on an October evening one year, almost exactly. From the October morning, she'd opened her gate and looked at a man with an aging horse and 4 children in a wagon, and made a calculation that she hadn't had the information to make correctly and had made anyway. She was at the study desk. Bram was beside her, going through the winter preparation list, which was real and needed doing. Outside, Tobin and Reed were doing something in the yard that involved some amount of argument and a rope, and June's voice was audible from somewhere in the house explaining something, at length in the specific one-sided tone of a child who has found an audience and intends to use it. The winter range, Bram said. I want to ride out this week. Check the condition before we move the herd. Thursday, she said. I'll come. You don't need to. I know. She marked something in the account book. I want to. He looked at her briefly, with the expression that was the real one, the one she'd first seen at the campfire in the winter range when he'd talked about Clara and June's questions and the promise he'd made and kept. The one that was warm and certain and didn't need to be anything other than what it was. Thursday, then, he said. She thought about what she understood now that she hadn't understood a year ago, when she'd stood at her father's grave, with her jaw set and her hands folded and watched the men around her, calculating whether she would break. What she understood was that the calculation had been wrong from the start, not because she was stronger than they'd estimated, though she was, but because they'd been calculating the wrong thing. They'd been calculating her alone. They'd been calculating her alone. They'd been measuring one person against the weight of Silver Crown and finding the arithmetic close enough to make them comfortable with their waiting. They hadn't seen the wagon at the gate. They hadn't seen what was in it. And that was the thing about the help you didn't know you needed. It didn't arrive looking like help. It arrived looking like a complication, a condition you hadn't anticipated, a man who wouldn't take the wages without bringing his family, 4 children you'd never agreed to inherit, 2 extra beds in a room that had been used for storage. It arrived looking like something that would make an already difficult situation harder. And then winter came, and the pass closed and the storm hit, and you were in it with the people who had showed up for reasons that had nothing to do with your plans. And what you found was that the people you hadn't planned on were the ones you couldn't have managed without. You couldn't engineer that. You couldn't put it in a ledger or a map. You could only recognize it when it arrived. which required being the kind of person who could see past the complication to what was actually there, and being the kind of person who, having seen it, had the sense to open the gate. She had opened the gate. She was every day glad she had. Outside, whatever Tobin and Reed were doing with the rope reached some kind of resolution that involved a shout and then laughter Reed's laugh, which was still slightly surprising every time because the boy was so quiet generally that his laugh had the quality of a rare bird briefly visible, and then Tobin's lower, harder-won version, and then June's voice calling from the house demanding to know what was funny. Bram heard it. He didn't say anything. He just listened for a moment with his pen still in his hand and the winter list in front of him, and his face had the look of a man who was home and knew it fully, all the way through. Lenora went back to the accounts. The numbers were good. The land was intact. The house had every lamp lit. And at Silver Crown, for the first time, in longer than Lenora could precisely measure, the work and the life had stopped being two separate things and had become, imperfectly and permanently, the same thing. That was enough. That was in the end everything.